Hey everyone, we have a very special edition of FreightWaves Now. I'm Emily Zing. Craig Fuller wrote a very insightful piece on FreightWaves.com. A lot of traction, a lot of activity going on, and Craig is talking about what the market looks like right now and what's to come in the future, and things aren't looking that optimistic at the moment.
You know, my view on the freight market has consistently been that it's softer. 19 has been softer than 18, and there's been signs of. You could make an argument that 19 has been a good year, and there's a lot of data to support that. You could also make an argument that 19 had signs that it was going to be a rough year. We've been looking at the data, and I don't think we've had a real clear consensus. And it almost feels like daily you're looking at new data points and saying, well, this sort of reinforces a bullish view, this reinforces a bearish view. The large publicly traded carriers, which we would describe as enterprise carriers, have been talking on conference calls and on analyst reports about decent or good conditions, historically good conditions. And so there's a big difference, though, in the small carrier. When you go onto the message boards, which a lot of small carriers get on and sort of voice their opinion, and there's a lot of noise there when the market's soft, they actually get more. They're more
vocal. They're emotional. Yeah.
And they're sitting at the truck stop with nothing to do and getting really upset because they're not making money. And so when you look at what they've been saying is they've been talking about it being very soft. We have seen data that certainly suggests that conditions are softening, but nothing that said that we could definitively say direction of the market is going to be, I'm going to use going towards a freight recession or going towards a, we're going to get out of this and have higher demand. There's no real definitive way to say it. I'm going to call it now, we're going to call it now, that I believe that the freight market is heading into a recession. And I will qualify this to say, I hope I'm wrong.
Are you saying for everyone? We're not just talking about the small carriers, we're talking about these larger enterprise guys who have contracted deals.
I'm talking about the entire market is heading into what I would classify as a freight recession. And let me explain what that means. So economist says 2 quarters of subsequent declining GDP growth is considered a recession. And so when you look at it from the definition of a freight market is when you have lower rates and lower volumes, that's certainly what we're seeing right now, and suggesting that second quarter is going to be a tough quarter. And this is probably going to exacerbate into the third quarter as well, and potentially could take us through the rest of the year. So
far, there's been a lot of stuff. You talked in this article, you went really in depth, but right now you're talking about spot rates down 36%, was it? 36%
on the DAT National Freight Index, which is assessment of specific lanes, typically longer length of haul and high lanes. It is a benchmark of the freight market. If you want to know the general freight conditions of the spot market, it's a great way to understand that.
So these drivers aren't getting the rates that they're used to.
They're not getting the rates. And so the spot rates have been down. They've been down all year, and that's certainly not news to anybody that's in freight. Contract rates are these quote-unquote contract rates because they're not really contracted. You know, when I sign a contract to buy a house or buy a car, the company can sue me if I don't honor that contract. In most freight transactions, there are very little contracted rates. Is basically the agreement is 48 hours out. You may have a rate on file, it's a contracted rate, but that rate, that shipper and carrier for that matter, have the right to move that rate at any moment in time. They typically don't in a market where things are flat. But what we're seeing now is that shippers, the largest shippers in the country, are clawing back those contracted rates that they agreed to last year and in some cases earlier this year. They're saying, look, the market dynamics have changed. Volumes are now falling apart, and we know that we can get capacity moved, our loads moved at much cheaper rates, and that's what we're seeing.
And also you wrote another good thing, and another point that's hurting people is the price of oil.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one that I think is, so when I grew up, my dad used to talk about oil prices, and every recession was sort of driven by high oil prices. And then something really weird happened a couple of years ago that actually when oil prices collapsed in 2015, 2016, historically that would have been a really good thing for trucking because when oil drops, then just the cost of goods drop, the cost of fuel and variable cost drops. That cycle was different because U.S. oil production has been such an important part of our economy and has been driving the industrial market. So we saw oil prices collapse at the same time that volume collapsed. But that actually helped out a lot of the small carriers because their costs were dropping at the same time volumes were dropping and rates. This time it's different because what you have is a situation where volumes are dropping, oil prices are actually higher than they were at the start of the year, so fuel prices are going up, and the small carriers don't typically benefit from fuel surcharges. Fuel surcharges are used to offset the variability cost of fuel and diesel prices. And so because of that, the small carriers are in a different position than the large carriers. The large carriers can pass that cost on to the shippers.
Okay.
The small carriers cannot. And so when the fuel prices increase, those are the guys that get impacted most dramatically.
Could you even say that some people in a few months may not be able to pay to even run their truck if the price gets too high?
I mean, it's already started.
Okay.
So you looked at, there had been 2 major bankruptcies this year that we've seen. So New England Motor Freight, which happened at the end of, I think it was mid-February, around Valentine's Day. So New England Motor Freight filed bankruptcy. This was a Northeastern LTL carrier, but it had some truckload assets. And then Falcon, a 700 truck flatbed carrier, also
just shut its doors.
Just shut down. And unfortunately, drivers were stranded. And then there's been some, there was an Alabama motor carrier that had about 70 trucks, not as big as Falcon, but certainly for those drivers, they don't care what the numbers are if you're the driver impacted. So we're starting to see that. We saw Schlumberger out in the oil fields shut down a trucking fleet as well. Penske is doing a layoff in July related to an auto plant. It looks like an auto plant shutdown or an auto plant change that's caused them to get rid of their fleets there. So we're seeing that happen. Okay. And you're hearing, I have not seen it in the data yet, but you're hearing stories about, people telling stories personally about how they left trucking or their friend left trucking or their aunt left trucking or their uncle, whatever. And so you're seeing this happen, seeing it take place.
If I'm a small carrier right now, watching this, what should I do? With all of this data you have and what you're predicting for the future of freight, what do I do right now?
Well, I think this is more of a short term. When I talk about future, I'm always thinking, for me, my horizon is a 3 to 5 year type horizon when I say the word future. This is now. Okay. This is immediate, and this is what you're dealing with right now. This is not a cycle that this particular cycle, the lack of freight demand and the soft pricing is going to impact cash flows today. And if I'm a carrier, I'm not thinking about what happens in 3 years. I'm thinking about what am I going to do over the next 30, 60, 90 days.
How do I get my paycheck?
To protect myself, correct. So how do I get paid, right? It's all about the money. And so the thing that carriers need to do, number one, is ensure that they're running in markets that have freight. That is the most important thing to do. Price aside, I'm not saying go in there and be cheap. You want to maximize price, but you want to run in markets where freight is there.
Can you get greedy though? You can't get greedy with your rate at that point.
Well, you're gonna, everybody's greed is a natural instinct for a small business owner. That's what businesses do, is they maximize price. Everybody should be maximizing price. But in this environment, not all markets are created equal. So if you take a load, because it pays $3 a mile, but you then have to, you take it to Miami because it pays $3 a mile, and you got a deadhead all the way from Miami to Atlanta to sit for a day, then that doesn't help you. No. That is a lost utilization, lost rate. So it's not about rates. Rates are not, in this environment, the most important thing. It's about keeping that truck running in very dense lanes. So know market conditions in the market, know what lanes you're going to be in and out of, look at the market demand maps. DAT publishes them, Truckstop has them. We have our, we call haul map, which shows balance. Those indicators can arm you with data. Also, call up brokers and say, look, where are you seeing? So if you don't want to subscribe to any services, that's fine. You can go and call up brokers and say, look, I want to keep running. What lanes can you keep me running in? Can I do a long month-to-month deal with you, and I will run for you for the next 2 months to 3 months at this price? There are a lot of creative strategies that you can do. The guys that are going to sit at the truck stops and try to maximize that rate, that maximize that rate per mile and says, I am really concerned about it, they're the ones that are going to lose out in this environment. It worked beautifully last year. They made a lot of money, really, really smart, because they said, I'm not taking cheap freight, I'm going to maximize the rate. This is a different market, and frankly, a lot of drivers have never seen this kind of market. Even 2015 and 2016, as soft as it was, is not like this market is likely to be. We're more likely to look at 2007, 2008. We're more, if we go into a true recession, this is going to be a very different market than they've ever seen, and they need to be very defensive. So if I were them, I wouldn't be thinking, I'd be thinking about cash flow, I'd be thinking about my budget, how much do I need to make to keep my truck payments, my insurance payments, know my variable and fixed cost. If I know those, then I know what I need to make.
Would you suggest just stepping out of the truck for a while?
That's tough, because if you have a long-term lease or a long-term payment, then it's very difficult. If you can sell your truck today at a price that you are made whole, you've made a lot of money last year, and you can get out, and you're not committed to being in the industry, then that's not a horrible outcome. A lot of drivers are not in that situation. Yeah. This is a cash flow business, and they're having to pay for their truck as they run. In those situations, I think they need to make a hard look at how they're managing their business. Again, rates are not the most important thing. They're important. They're not most important for a driver.
It's a lot of good stuff to take in. Why is this? Why are we going towards 2008 numbers, towards a recession? What is causing this?
I think there's been catastrophic changes in the economy that unlike we've ever seen. And what I'm saying about that is I don't want to get overly political, but the challenge is when you change supply chains and you put tariffs on imports, freight needs global trade. Imports drive the freight market. We just don't produce enough here, and this is not something short term. Could you fix this by slapping tariffs? There's arguments yes or no, but it's not going to be a short-term problem. We're feeling the pain of tariffs. So look, if you believe tariffs are good for the long-term strength of the U.S. economy, then you also have to accept, or you have to realize that by doing that, there's a short-term impact. It's not going to help us short-term. And so when we put tariffs on our global suppliers like China and Canada and Mexico and Europe, all of a sudden the cost of those items become more expensive for businesses, which means they have less money to pay for people, which means they have less, it costs them more to produce products. We're just less competitive. Here's the other thing that's less appreciated about that is we also are dependent upon exports. And so when you increase tariffs, there's a retaliatory nature of that. China slaps a tariff on our exports, which then drives down volume. So we're basically, tariffs we all lose in that.
Yeah.
But that's one side of it, and that's what's caused this sort of short-term shock. The bigger issue is last year was so good for trucking that even the most unsophisticated players, the people who had no idea how to run a trucking company, could make good money because all high tides lift all boats. Yep. And what happened is there's so many folks that came into trucking, and fleet managers looked at it, people that own trucking fleets, and said, the market's really, really good. It's going to be like this for a long time. They started adding trucks. And when they added trucks, there's a lot more capacity in the market than there. And last year was great. They were doing well. They were really proud of their decisions because they said, I made a lot more money because I added trucks. This year, we wake up where we don't have as high volume. You have a lot more trucks on the road, about 5% increase in trucks. And as long as, the volumes were sort of flat, weren't great. But what we're seeing now is it looks like a recession, an economic freight recession, combined with an oversupplied capacity map. It's going to be an ugly washout for people.
So if I went out and I was so optimistic last year and I got a new truck, I got a few new trucks, am I selling that this year? I don't have the cash flow to pay for that.
If you have to make a decision for yourself. So I would certainly suggest that if you don't believe that you can make money in this environment and you're not making money, and you can sell your equipment today, you're going to, so the rates, the price of used trucks is going to be higher today than it's likely to be in a few months.
Because there's going to be so many.
There's going to be so many trucks because whether it's bankruptcies, look, if we're right, and I want to say this, I hope I'm wrong. This is the one time in my life that I hope that I'm definitively wrong about what we're seeing. But I can't find any data that supports the opposite. I can't find any data that gives me a view that says that we're going to cut, this is going to be a short-term issue. And because of that, there is going to be a ton of bankruptcies. There's going to be a lot of drivers that sell equipment. And I would not want to be the last guy to show up to sell my equipment.
No, not at all. You're going to get the lowest price.
You're right now, used truck prices on three-year-old used truck prices are about $68,000. And based on that number, if you look at the lows back in even 15, 16, you look at the lows in 2007 and 2008, we're talking about truck prices that could drop to $45,000 to $50,000. And what happens is that's a $20,000 impact by waiting to sell my truck. So if you're going to get out of the market, you need to decide that pretty quickly, and you don't want to be the last guy there. You just don't, because it's like selling your house where everybody else is listed there.
Yeah, everyone on the block, and then you decide you want to do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing to keep in mind is that what's going to happen is a lot of drivers went out last year and bought new equipment. A lot of carriers bought new equipment. They're more fuel economy. They get better fuel economy. They're nicer. They have better features for the drivers. Newer trucks just ride and smell better than older trucks, frankly.
Well, yeah.
And so a lot of drivers added more expensive equipment. Trucks were actually really expensive last year because there was so much demand for them, but the OEMs, the truck manufacturers, could charge a lot higher than they would if the market was different. So they went out and bought these very expensive trucks. And if they can't make payment on those trucks, then what's going to end up happening is it's just going to bring everything down.
Is it all bad? We're talking, like you said, you hope that you're wrong. The one time that you hope that you're wrong. Is it all bad right now?
It's not great.
Okay.
It's not, look, I mean, is it
You're trying to sugarcoat.
No, I don't think I
No,
sugarcoat, but I would say, I mean, can I find any piece of data that says there's something redeeming about the market? If I listen to some of the analysts and listen to some of the conference calls and talk to companies, some of the companies are doing fine. And up until a month ago, companies were great. We wrote that piece, and in the last 24 hours, or the last 12 hours, I received about 5 emails or text messages from CEOs of billion-dollar-plus freight companies that said, you're spot on, you're correct. And I actually thought there may be more blowback. I thought, well, no one likes bad news.
No, not at all.
And so I was surprised by that. But what I'm hearing are stories about one company said that they're a 4PL, which means they manage a freight for a lot of company, that their routing guide, that they're 70% uncompliant, which means they're actually going outside the routing guide to spot freight. The shippers are demanding they put loads into the spot market. I've heard stories and seen emails of shippers, big food shipper, that said they're not going to honor the rates for their contracting commitments. I'm hearing stories about big retailers and big consumer package companies, big air freight LTL companies asking for rate reductions. And so it's happening. And because of that, I don't have anything from a data standpoint that reinforces that conditions are good. Here's the upside. A washout isn't a bad thing long term.
Okay.
And I explain why. We need to purge. We need to have an event that purges a lot of capacity.
It makes sense.
At a time when people can find good employment. I don't like a situation where people lose their jobs or are faced with issues and don't have the opportunity to find other employment. That's not good for anybody. But we're in an economy that has really tight labor markets. And as long as that holds up, it's not a bad choice for people to say, I may not want to run and be an owner-operator, or I may not want to run to work for this fleet that can't keep me running, and may choose alternative employment. That's not a bad thing, because what will happen is the market will contract, it will right-size, it will probably overcorrect to the downside, to the point where we go through another economic cycle and builds up again, and all of a sudden we start over again. This happens. This is a cyclical industry. Up and down, up and down. We are at a point where the market needs to admit, people in the market need to admit that the market's softer. That actually lets us start to make decisions that will fix this problem.
For the people watching right now, this is a developing story, like you said, almost breaking news. What data made you come to this conclusion, made you want to get this article up for everyone to see?
So it was a lot of data. It's the DAT National Freight Index van rates that we've seen that and watched that. Spot rates have been down. We've seen that. We've seen ELD utilization. The way shippers are managing drivers' hours is not as efficient as they were. So I've seen a lot of data. The one that got my attention was the outbound tender volume index, and it dropped 6% in a week. That is worse than holidays. So we have this massive, massive, massive drop in volume. Started on May 9th, which coincidentally was the same date that Trump tweeted about putting the tariffs went into effect, I should say. And so we saw that was the peak. Actually, May 8th, May 9th was the peak in terms of volumes for this particular cycle. And it dropped 6% in the middle of May. That is
you said
not
that's
normal.
usually
That
a
is
big
not
time.
normal.
Yeah.
May carriers make a lot of money in May and June. These are really strong freight period. Just like September, October, and early November is typically really strong. May to June dropping that significantly in the month of May is very, very, very dramatic. And when I saw that data, that's the canary in the coal mine. That is suggesting that something significant is happening in the market.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, and then you start talking about it. And obviously, like you said, this is developing. This is something to watch.
And how do we know it's trade? So I'll tell you this. And so if you look at the LA market, so outbound tender volume, OTVI.LAX, that actually dropped off by 30%.
And you're talking about that's where ports are. That's where stuff's coming in.
LA has been driving. If you look at what's been driving the freight economy for the past 6 months, it's been all import activity.
Okay.
So we've had massive amounts of imports, really staging of freight into the economy before tariffs went into effect. And on May 9th, it changed. And so what actually happened is we saw a dramatic drop off in volume related to that.
Anything to look ahead to, anything that you're really keeping your eye on, what you're watching, what others need to be weary of or watch?
Yeah, I think we're looking at all the data. OTVI is when we're watching. We're watching tender rejections to see if there's any uptick there. We're looking at capacity. Capacity is growing by 5%. We track that as well. And so we're looking at all the data. I think this short-term pain will need for it to really reset. We're going to need a couple of months of this. This is probably a 2019 story. This is probably going to take throughout the rest of the year to really play out.
Like you said, you hope you're wrong, but the numbers right now are showing.
I hope I'm wrong, but whether it's intermodal data, whether it's air cargo data, whether it's just the data that we've got, or even stories from companies. I talked to a large third-party logistics company late last night. Said they're talking about 10%, doing a 10% rate reduction across the board in the month of June.
Wow.
That is a significant change. This is a multi-billion-dollar 3PL that's talking about putting capacity on sale because they want to ensure they have enough volume to keep running in the month of June.
Yeah, definitely a developing story you'll continue to watch, and the team here at FreightWaves will continue to watch. Thanks, Craig. Thanks for joining us on this special edition of FreightWaves Now. A lot of insight from FreightWaves CEO Craig Fuller. Definitely something, like he said, he hopes he's wrong, but something we will continue to watch. You can watch us on social media. We're going to continue to update that. And as always, the stories will keep coming on FreightWaves.com.